The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, and I'm overjoyed to be bringing you this very last lecture out of this series of lectures of Debussy's La Mer. We left off previously with a section of pacing where things were on the verge of becoming pedestrian, and then Debussy hit us with this massive brass break. Almost like a big break in a pop song where all the brass players stand up and start going nuts, kind of like Tower of Power or Blood, Sweat, and Tears. But, of course, done in a Debussy style. Now we're going to go forwards, and this is kind of the wrap-up of this idea, this main theme for the finale. Ba-bum-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum. Notice that the key signature is 4 sharps. This is C sharp minor. And we're going to go back to D flat major, but Debussy has modulated to this key signature because it has an E natural as the mediant, so that turns it into C sharp minor. So just to change it back to F, we're going to have to change the entire reality, the entire landscape. Well, I mean, it's just like one single note right in the middle, right? But the context of major versus minor is actually a fairly big shift, as we'll see. So let's study the building blocks of the texture before we jump onto the melody. Starting off, we have pianissimo, the strings just sort of fluttering back and forth. They really do look like the beating of wings, don't they? And you sort of see that kind of opposite direction of each pair of Debussy staves. So you've got the top firsts going A, G sharp, right, da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. And we've got the second staff of Debussy firsts doing exactly the opposite. It's like starting on high A, going down an octave, coming back, and then down a half step to G sharp. And this is very, very similar to several other works. I would say probably the most notable that you might be aware of as a listener would be the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, where he's got horns playing octaves that cross, right? So the first horn is playing, I think it's an E, so E and it slurs down an octave, and then the second is playing E and it slurs up an octave. So you get this boa, boa kind of sound. And it's kind of a sneaky way of using portato and legato at the same time. And it's a wonderful effect, but the sort of painful thing about it is you can't really hear it because the winds and the brass are so much more penetrating, even at piano, that they kind of cover what is going on here in the strings, and they don't get any softer, right? They just stay loud. So it's a wonderful effect all the same. I would say don't score things like this yourself unless you know that it is going to be easy. So it would seem as if this would be an open A, but I think the players would be actually sitting up there in, I think, 4th position, and then just sort of moving it up and down. So it's not that difficult. But there are a lot of ways to make it too hard. So if you're going to emulate something like this, keep it simple at first unless you are a string player and you really understand what you are doing. Everything reverses itself, going to the seconds and going to the violas, which play the exact same thing as the seconds down an octave. And then the cellos are just left to themselves to play G-sharp octaves and so on. What I find the most compelling, though, here are the basses. So we've got this tenuto, staccato, tie, right? So it's da-da-da. And then at the end of the tie, the other half of the Debussy basses come in and play right on the second beat. So that is almost trading off with the most rhythmically punctuating instrument of all, which is, of course, the bass drum. So you've got this boom, boom, going on. But this actually isn't going to be heard as much as the beginning of the timpani, right? So you've got this da-da-da, 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 boom, da-da, da-da-da. It's a very cool rhythm. And then, of course, a splash at the beginning of every other bar from your cymbals. What else is going on? There are these wonderful little opposites happening with the piccolo going all the way up to this high E, which would be just a little bit above where the standard flute can play, highest E on the piano. And then we've got this low G sharp note being played by the contrabassoon, right? And just to remind one last time, I hope I don't have to remind anybody of this again in any of these lectures, and that is that the engraver has chosen to score the contrabassoon part at pitch rather than transposing the octave like the double basses. So yeah, so what you read is the exact note, that low G sharp, bah. So, ba-dee, ba-dee, bah. Actually, not all that loud, but I've heard some contrabassoon players sort of amp it up. So right here, they get to about mezzo forte, right? The mezzo piano, mezzo forte, and so on. It's a bit of a subjective thing, isn't it? Where is the dynamic of the orchestra going? Nothing is fixed. It's not like you can turn these up and down on dials. And that's one of the things that's so deceptive about the playback on a notation software application. The playback is fixed, but in terms of the actual playing, it's like the hall makes a bunch of difference, how much of response it has. That might change the actual tempo of the work. And there's also just the vibe of where everybody's going. What does molto crescendo mean? That is subjective, and I think nicely, because it doesn't stick the players in the doldrums of what mezzo piano means. What does mezzo piano mean anyways, right? If you're telling a melody instrument to play mezzo piano. So Debussy wisely avoids that, but it does leave room for interpretation. And so long as the music can balance, which it can, then the conductor can just maybe tell the contrabassoon player, hey, could you play mezzo forte right there, or whatever, if they're not playing loud enough. But the players will usually know how much energy to put into something. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the harmony. In addition to all of these rhythmic patterns, we've got the clarinets and the bassoons playing C-sharp thirds an octave apart. Now, you might be thinking, but isn't that an E-flat minor third or E-flat? Yeah, so but that's, you have to think these are B-flat clarinets, an E-flat third down a major second, sounding down a major second, and harmonically is a C-sharp third. And emerging from the lower bassoons, from their wonderful, warm, chesty sound, is this more snarling sound of the stopped horns. Notice the word cuivre. All right, so cuivre usually means to play in a brassy style, which is a specific kind of technique. It is not just like some nebulous, subjective kind of quality where just like, just like whatever, just play louder. It really means that the player is going to tighten their lips outward by pulling the edges of the mouth backwards and then playing with a more kazoo-like buzzing. I have a tip on this in 100 More Orchestration Tips, so go look it up there. But that's not what's going on here. Debussy uses the word cuivre to mean a stopped horn, right? So the player has just really got their hand closing the air passage, and it gives a very, very snarly sound. And that should emerge out from the beautiful warmth of the bassoons. It's this kind of thinner sound. And it has a very sinister sound. It's almost a cliche that the stopped horns will portray the bad guy entering the scene in an opera, for instance. Notice that they're doubled. So they're there is a kind of a richer sound, even though it is thin and sort of nasty. It has a bit of a waxed mustache to it. The basic accompaniment is going to continue on with some of these harmonic rolls becoming more chorale-like in your lower winds as da 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 the melody develops here, and it really is the same thing with our oboe, English horn at octaves apart, and right here the first bassoon doubling the English horn. And speaking of chesty sounds, has a wonderful chesty sound, very tenor-like. It has this kind of singing quality. Really sounds almost like an aria right there in the middle. Like a tenor is just really kind of pushing high with their voice. And when we get to this point right in here, it is still octaves. Remember your transposition of everything called a horn, right? So horns transpose sounding down a fifth. So sounding down a fifth from F sharp is B natural, right? So these are octaves. And doubling the English horn is first and third horn. And that is enough to overwhelm the quality of tone, the ability of the audience to really hear the English horn as a distinct instrument. But it will blend together with the horns, and it's better to have it in there rather than just to drop it out, even though it's not as audible as it could be. And especially with this push right in here, it helps the sort of readiness to have more reeds involved in this crescendo right here. Now, things move onwards. Ba 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 ba. And we are going to a kind of an old trick of Debussy's that he used earlier in the piece, and that is to have chromatic whole tone harmony. So in other words, he starts off with the connotation of one whole tone scale, and then he shifts down a half step with everything and down another half step, taking us back to the original whole tone scale. And he does that again and again. You might remember us talking about it in previous lectures. So he's bringing back that quality of harmony here once more to kind of look back at it before he becomes very consonant on the next screen. Now right in here, things keep descending, and notice we've got the oboes on top, octave lower, English horn, and the same basic thing is happening here. The horns are doubling the English horn, which we saw before, and then they're being harmonized by second and fourth horn from below, and then by cornets, sort of in the middle, between the oboe and the collected horns, English horn and standard horn melody. Right, so the cornets sit there in the middle, and they are almost bright enough to overwhelm the oboe right up here, but not quite enough, right? So that's why cornets are being used here instead of trumpets. If you've got them and you want a sound that has a wonderful character to it, but is less penetrating, then the cornets are the use right there. They're not just weak trumpets, but they have a specific color that really adds. And beautifully played, they can blend in wonderfully with the double reeds right in here. And then right at the end we have a big push outwards. Notice like some instruments coming in soft and then getting caught up in the excitement. So this can be a really big, deliberate push into the next page where we really go to forte. But notice that the strings are still playing softly, right? Piano. And there's this little bit of a kind of a backwards hairpin, which can be interpreted as like emphasis rather than starting off soft and getting softer, which is how this would be interpreted by a notation app playback, right? But in this case, it means to sort of push right here in the middle and then ease off. So piano, and then it's more like going up to mezzo forte and then relaxing back to piano staccato right at the end of each little group. But otherwise, It's all constructed exactly the same in terms of the relationships of the instruments, the harmony, and everything else. The root of the harmony is D flat rather than C sharp because we have an F, right, as the mediant rather than an E. And we still have that same kind of rock bottom note that was being played before, only interpreted as A flat rather than G sharp. Don't get hung up too much if you are an intonation buff in the, wondering whether or not it would be still okay to mark this as a G sharp in the timpani, because roots and fifths should stay the same in terms of their tuning in orchestral intonation. It's really the mediant and like the sixth and so on and so forth, like from the root, that might have some bit of nebulousness, but not to get too sidetracked. Don't let that worry you too much when you see a root or a fifth being written out enharmonically if you're obsessed with intonation. Okay, let's stay focused on this. Same pacing as before with the timpani and the double basses and everything else, and the little tish every second bar. And then some harmonic qualities in here. The bassoon's playing D flat thirds, and the horns are actually playing the same exact notes, right? And the cornets are playing D flat thirds above. Notice that the cornets are in C, right? They're not in B flat. And that can really throw people who are used to score reading cornets in B flat. But yeah, the Debussy scores them in C, which makes me wonder whether or not they were played on C cornets. It's something you don't really see all that much, if at all. I don't think I've ever seen a C cornet, but maybe they were common for Debussy, or he just didn't know any better and he just scored it that way. So we've got that harmony, that harmonic pad, and sort of the rock bottom A flat right in here, speaking of contrabassoon. And the melody gets very big here. Da 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 da. The flute's on top, doubled by the oboe, doubled by the first clarinet. Really, really rich, big, almost wind band-like. Octave lower, we've got the English horn and the second clarinet. And then an octave below that, we have the third bassoon doubling the second and fourth horns. Nice for them to get some melody. The reason for doubling the bassoon with the horns, even though it's not really going to be heard that much, is to sort of temper the sound, adjust it slightly, just a little bit of a color adjust to the horns, which makes their sound more compatible with the winds riding on top, right? So just a little trick. And a little bit of piccolo going toot-toot above. Now, this is all leading towards this massive, beautiful brass chorale. But before I unpack that, let's take a look at what's happening around it. Once again, we have a softer accompaniment and just a really direct, dynamically marked up main part in the middle. These winds are basically playing around the same pitches as the strings, and in terms of timing, they can all be divided the same way, right? We have these quarter note triplets. They rhythmically match up with eighth note triplets just on different places, right? And notice that everything is not exactly timed to hit right on the money. This right here would be on the second note of an eighth note triplet on the second beat. But we can see that this is actually sort of a suspension, right? So the previous chord is held onto for just another eighth and then shifting over to match the harmony of the winds. So that's kind of a nice bit of nebulosity, I think, to the whole rhythmic structure right in here. That's everything that's happening around it, and the harmony just changes to match what's going on in the brass. So let's talk about that brass. This is a really effective way of scoring. Starting off here, we have A2 trumpets. We've got trombones playing an octave and a fifth on B flat, low B flat octave below. The trumpets are going to be sounding on B flat as well, up a fourth, because these are F trumpets. And the horns are supplying the harmony in the middle. If you were to completely take Rimsky-Korsakov's dictum of horns being twice as weak as trumpets, then you might think, well, wow, shouldn't I have A4 horns to match the A2 trumpets below? Well, you shouldn't, because what Rimsky-Korsakov says is sort of true and sort of not, right? You can't just assume that you will lose any kind of spreading in the horns, any kind of rich harmony, just because you're so worried about them being buried by the heavy brass. I would say from forte onwards, right, getting up to fortissimo or triple F, yes, you really should try to match 2 horns for every 1 heavy brass in terms of harmony like this. But very sonorous, but not heavy, right? So not having too much inertia. He wants it to be a rich, round sound, and especially with this wonderful portato here, ba, 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 ba. It just has this wonderful floating sound, right? It should float. It shouldn't sink, if you want to put it another way. So A2 horns playing in harmony are quite enough. You don't need to quadruple them up just to match the A2 trumpets, is what I'm trying to say, basically. And notice that we've got single trombones and tuba, they're not doubling up on anything. So this follows the Rimsky-Korsakov thing. It's just that the trumpets are doubled even yet above, right? So if we're thinking this is B flat in the middle of the staff, sounding down a fifth is F, and sounding down a fifth here is D flat. So it really is just like a B flat minor 6/3 chord, even though it looks like an F minor triad. So this is wonderful, the way things telescope, with the tuba coming up to E flat and the choral melody dropping down, and the trombones coming together into an E flat third. Just such wonderful scoring. And then coming back to the chord in a big, rich crescendo. Then moving outwards, we have this big old G flat major chord. And notice there's some doubling here of this note here. This is sounding B flat, written F. But then the other parts of the chord are not doubled. This D flat and A flat here. And then this is sounding D flat above. It's a more spread out chord, Q F, so even more loud and pushing into it. So right around here, it's a poco fortissimo. Not quite scorching, but just really getting close to being very loud. But he doesn't want it to be too heavy, right? So just they have to hold back a little bit. So bum, 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 bum. And then kind of the same thing as before. Bum, 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 bum. Pushing towards a massive root D-flat major chord. Really bringing home the sense of harmonic finality that the rest of the lecture, the rest of the piece is going to be rushing towards. But once again, avoiding common practice 5-1 sort of resolution, going from B flat up to D flat, right? Rather than being like a perfect cadence or anything like that. So just really is approaching his harmonic hit points without being obvious. Was the main thing, is just avoiding being obvious. And then, of course, as I said before, the accompaniment is really kind of staying the same. And this is really symphonic scoring. The winds and the strings, they're backing up their fellow players in the brass section and letting them have their moment of glory, because it all works out together when you come to the end of it. So listen for all of those things. Really listen for the quality of sound, of having the horns right in the middle of the picture and supporting the trumpets above, and being kind of the bridge between the trumpets and the trombones. There's just nothing like that wonderful quality. There's a bit of this too in the promenade of Pictures at an Exhibition as orchestrated by Ravel. He uses some of this same approach, which is pretty standard actually when you think about it. But done in the right way, with really nice proportions, especially right in here. I just feel it gets so grand. And if you're thinking that you're playing just about at fortissimo here, and still you can hear the middle of this chord, this written D flat and A flat, sounding G flat and D flat, and they don't need to be doubled, then obviously the Rimsky-Korsakov thing about always doubling your horns against heavy brass in a loud passage especially is not necessarily always true, right? It just depends on how much support of those middle notes can be reinforced by other instruments, right? So if you've got this really strong D flat right in here of the second trombone, that is going to support the sound of this note right here, sounding D flat in the fourth horn, for instance. And then, of course, the sounding G flat written D flat has some support from this root right in here. So you don't have to be mathematical about it. You don't need to be constantly calculating, have I got this right? The horns can be used in very rich ways, but I mean, some doubling is indicated. Check out my tip on scoring for three-part harmony and horns in 100 More Orchestration Tips. I do talk about it there too. Approaches, which, it's not just three voices in the horns, it could also apply to a big chord like this. Okay, so listen for all of those things. The main thing is the quality of the timbre in the way that these chords are voiced and scored out. See what you think of the dynamic contrast between the accompaniment and the main act right here in the middle. And speaking of contrasts, listen to how the texture here contrasts going forward as the idea leads into the brass chorale. So it's two different things at work here. One is a contrast and the other one is carrying forwards, right? So obviously these two textures here on either side of this screen are very, very different in some ways, and yet they do complement each other. They do sort of carry forward. A lot of the functions here are really kind of being boiled down into a simpler idea, right? We've got B flat, B flat, B flat, A flat, right? So really we have that da 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 da. And it's kind of the same idea here, right? E flat, E flat, E flat, D flat. So the players are just not being asked to jump back and forth an octave in the middle. So it's the same basic kind of function, but just changed into staccatos and so on, and then matching the mezzo staccato of the winds right in here. Be that as it may, it really is a different sound, and especially with brass right in the middle, and really kind of picking up on the overtones, I feel. That's a lot of this is about overtones coming off of the brass and just how to make them rich and really bright without being blinding. Then, of course, listen for the octave doubling here in the winds and the horns. Listen for that quality of timbre of the cornets on the higher step of the harmony right in here, with the horns and the bassoons teaming up below and the cornets above. Then just in general, just the way these textures are constructed, throbbing around each other in that configuration. And, little touch of piccolo above, kind of followed by the foghorn of the contrabassoon below, and the emerging of the horns from the bassoons, which I feel is just really the funnest part of this whole page. Clarinets above, which eventually are taken over by the cornets on the next page, right? That same exact harmonic notch. And then how the cornets right in here work together with the oboes and English horns as much as they do over the four horns below. So listen for all of those things, and I will see you in just half a minute or so for the last half of this last lecture covering Debussy's La Mer. For the last three screens of this lecture. And what's interesting about this is that I find myself recasting these pages of score into basically regions, passages, or sections of passages that make sense within one another. And it is especially true with these last 3 screens, which I think cover 4 or 5 pages. Starting off with this massive chord, which is actually repeated right at the end, identical. That everything is doing exactly the same thing in the chord in terms of the position, the dynamics, everything is just the same. And even the swirling strings coming off the end of it. The only difference is just a little bit of these middle strings, or cello and viola to be precise. Right? They're doing something different right in here. But everybody else is the same, and the effect is really the same. So this is a hugely brassy sounding chord, and I would say even with the most balanced orchestra, it's very hard to hear the winds in here, to kind of show you just how difficult it is when you take the strings out of the picture. The upper strings are doing no kind of doubling right in here of these winds, except for maybe just like on the first 16th of the first beat, there is some doubling of A flat, but that really doesn't add any weight to what's going on here in the winds. So when you have just the winds above competing with the brass below, the most you can really hope for is that the winds will somehow reinforce the overtones of what's going on in the brass. It is just so powerful, so strong here, and it really doesn't look like it's playing that high, but this is actually F at the top of the staff, which is, a fairly high note. F, and the A flat is actually a D flat, so you've got those D flat thirds, and they're very powerful. And of course, taking the next part of the harmony down, we have a big E flat octave chord. It looks like an A flat major chord, but just think down a fifth, right? So it's a D flat major chord, kind of inhabiting the next part of the harmony down from the trumpets. And then below that, we've got our trombone. So this note right here is actually, this D flat right in here by the trombones is actually doubling what's going on the second horn, and then this written E flat is the same as this A flat here in the second trombone, and so on. So there's some overlapping, but right in the middle, we do have this F third, F and A flat sounding, written C and E flat. And that is not doubling anybody, but it still comes through really nicely. As I said before, it's not necessary to double the horns in order to get a balance. Now, probably what Rimsky-Korsakov would have done here would have been to just double the C and the E flat in both staves of horns, and then just let the trombones be all by themselves. But I actually like the mixed color right in here. I think it's wonderful. And then, of course, rock bottom tuba below. So this is really what you can hear right here in this massive tutti. Same thing right here, as I was saying before. And big rolled timpani. There's even the same extra beat at the end. Looking at all the other elements, the bassoons are doubling the trombones. The third bassoon is doubling the tuba. We've got a kind of a mixture here, if we were to say what is doubling what in the rest of the brass. Debussy wisely avoids really having too much in the middle there, right? At the most, we've got the F, which is doubling the third horn right in here. We've got this sounding A flat, which is also doubling the first horn. And then a little bit above here, the D flat and sounding F of the clarinet. So we've got this D flat in the second oboe. And so aside from that, like the rest of the winds are up above the sounds of the brass. And you would have to mark it triple forte, or you'd have to mark the brass forte rather than fortissimo to try to have the individual colors of the wind stand out rather than just reinforcing the overtones of the brass, I feel. So, once again, the same thing here. I missed mentioning the little rip up from the piccolo up to that high A flat. And of course, these are always risky to overuse. It's like a harp glissando. It's just used so many times, it becomes a cliche. It is so strong, in fact, that it's very hard to hear the strings. Even with an orchestra with a very big string section, it's really hard to hear these sweeping strings coming down, but it's better to have them than to not have them. And it's the same exact thing both times with that descent. And then, of course, the first time, rock bottom cellos doubling right at pitch rather than at the octave, the double basses, and then here they don't really need them, right? I mean, it doesn't really make any difference anyways because you've got the tuba sitting on that same note. Interesting that the contrabassoon is left out, except right in here, it plays this just little bit of a passage dipping down. Quite interesting here as well is the way the horns team up, bum, 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 da, da, dum, and then the cornets answer an octave higher, right? Because this is sounding down a fifth. So the cornets come in, or the first cornet comes in, bum, 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 da, da, dum. So it's just because of the brightness of the sound, it sounds louder than all four horns playing together. But I feel that in this recording, the horns are pulling back just a little bit, so as to, not be too Wagnerian or Mahlerian, if you want to put it that way. This is really cool in here. This push, this harmonic push, twice. This is the same exact thing both times. And in fact, it's the same exact thing both times in the rest of the accompaniment. This pluck, the same time as the strike on the bass drum. I keep wanting to say double bass drum. This hit on the bass drum, same time as the pluck. Notice that it's pizzicato and marcato. It's almost a Bartok pizzicato. It's very, very abrupt and loud. And this little swirling thing at the bottom here, hitting at the same time as the cymbal. So this really sort of trades off right in here. And it's actually not all that high, is it? It can be deceptive just the way that it's scored. The English horn and the clarinets and first bassoons are playing over similar pitches to the first violins and violas. And you could say sort of the same thing for the lower bassoons, the second and third bassoon, and the cellos. And then, of course, the basses doubling from yet another octave below. So these groups of instruments are basically intersecting with one another. But notice how it's a push to a forte and then a push from a piano to a forte that doesn't really finish, right? It doesn't dovetail the same way that it does here. And it's not, of course, a smooth dovetailing because it's a loud note with a soft phrase coming out of it from the strings. But here, we do have this wonderful swirling effect. I feel, that's my favorite part of this particular screen. Just the way that this starts to develop, and then here we see, or we hear the elements talking to one another, just moving back and forth. And the quality of timbre being so different between the two groups, and yet the functions being so similar, and yet the articulation being so different, it sets up this wonderful kind of contrast. And really, once again, Debussy avoiding the whole idea of huge arpeggiation to express the motion of the waves, and having very simple elements which are far easier and more natural to play orchestrally rather than sort of big pianistic arpeggios. He really does prove his point here just like nowhere else. And what's happening in the background? This nice little push here from trumpets and horns. And it's still A2 on the horns, right? So this would be a B double flat third, the enharmonic equivalent of an A major third. And the same thing is an octave higher from the first and second trumpet. So that provides this big push into the tutti chord again. And right here, by the end of this bar in these staves, the pressure can just be enormous depending on how much the players feel that they're encouraged to play out. Forte, crescendo to fortissimo, right? So with two of the loudest groups of instruments in the orchestra. Not quite as loud as the trombones, though. And then just the same exact thing happens again. So listen to it, see how much of the woodwind color you can perceive from the tutti when you do get to those two places. But I think it's just really cool that Debussy reuses the exact same two bars, and it still sounds really, really fresh and not just like a rehash of what happened in a previous page of score. Now, this is just a wonderful scoring of pacing. And we've got some bowing effects. Here we've got du talon, so in other words, this would be just a bunch of down bows at the frog, right? So bum 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 bum. And there's a bit of a condensation of that, dun dun da 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 dun, by the cornet, dun dun da 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 dun dun da da dun dun da da dun dun da da, and so on. So we have the two elements working against one another, a sort of double time on the cornets. And here we've got Près du Chevalet, so that would be not a bowing effect, but a string effect. So that would be playing what we would call sul ponticello in Italian. So sul ponticello, and this is just really kind of working off of a very standard 4/4 pacing. So there really isn't anything here that is expressing that kind of sense of walking except for the staccato bassoons. So we've got this bump, 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 bump between first and second bassoon and the middle strings right in here. Notice the articulation going from a tenuto staccato, which is unga, unga, unga. And here it is marcato staccato, right? And then we have the same thing happening here. Sul ponticello, he just marks it again in the seconds, and that is to sort of differentiate it from what's happening here, going to picking up on an octave doubling of what's going on the cellos and the basses and the violas. And then here, position ordinaire, that would be the same thing as saying norm or ord. Just notice the articulation styles evolving across this page. Now here we're getting to marcato on our lower strings. That is what's going on with the strings. And notice how the strings right in here is really picking up on the pattern that's happening here in the first clarinet and the English horn. And then the second clarinet takes over. The poor English horn player does not have a second English horn player to take over their part, so they just keep going. Then the first and second bassoons, A2, take over the same pattern at that same pitch. And the clarinet and oboe jump up an octave, and now they're doing it in octaves. Now we have A2. English horn comes back in on the same pattern, doubling what's going on with the bassoons, A2 clarinets as well. And then right here, that same pattern is taken over an octave higher in octaves with the upper strings. And I just really love the way that it builds in pitch. So we've got this lowest octave, and then putting an octave on top of it, and then jumping an octave. So you feel that swirling motion, right? And now right in here, as far as the lower winds are concerned, the lowest winds, the contrabassoon and the third bassoon, they're slowly starting to take over with a staccato version of this du talon kind of playing. It's really heavy tenuto, all down bows kind of stuff. So it's a really nice articulation contrast. Right in here, the horns start to take over for the first and second bassoon, as you would need. That kind of downbeat to the offbeat kind of pacing in the upper strings at this point. And it's a very good kind of groove to be going on behind the cornets. Really wonderfully supported. Meanwhile, what is the percussion doing? Well, they're actually not really playing that much in terms of pacing elements at first, right? First we just have some tam-tam going boosh, a very soft boosh, by the way. Just really is for a little bit of misty color rather than for its own sake. Now here you're getting a little bit of the offbeat pacing supported by a cymbal here, and it's timpani mallet on a suspended cymbal, which will just be used a soft yarn mallet. There was a big discussion in the Facebook group recently with some people insisting They used timpani mallets on their scoring, and that was fine for the cymbal player and so on and so forth. I got the sense that they were talking more about using a soft mallet for like drum kit rather than actually an orchestra, but I could be mistaken, so I don't want to put words in their mouth. But usually when a percussionist sees timpani mallets being indicated, they'll use a soft yarn mallet, because a timpani mallet being used, especially vigorously, on a cymbal will start to undo the felt on the outside of the mallet, start to sort of pull it apart, and it may actually even crash the core. So like the core of the mallet is made of a harder substance, and it has a really specific kind of density. And being used on a cymbal, which is a hard, unforgiving surface of metal, will basically mess up the core so that it doesn't have the same bounce anymore on the head of the timpani. So like, if you absolutely insist on a timpani mallet, then they'll probably just use a pair that are on their last legs. But if you don't insist and just watch what they do, they'll probably use just a soft yarn mallet, which will not fall apart. And then here, you start to get a little bit of pacing on the third beat each time. Dun 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 da da. Dun 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 da dun 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 dun. Right, so it just really has that great push in the middle of the bar. Now we're starting to finally reintroduce da-da right from the very beginning of the piece. Coming back, and once again, very sonorous, and probably Debussy would hope that they would remember not to play too heavy, right? So it's A4, right? So here's an example of using four horns together on a single melody in an impressionist work, rather than having to kind of go to Mahler for all of your examples of that. And trombones doing a very typical French kind of scoring, playing a 6/4 chord in the background. By this time, the first and second bassoons have taken over on that bum 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 bum. And contrasting with our little swirling strings right in here, we have the dotted rhythm in the winds, which sort of go to the same pitches, don't they? So you've got this E flat going to F, right? So you've got the same thing here, right? But it's more of a harmonic kind of a sound here. So clarinets and oboes basically playing the same thing, with the flutes above going E flat down to D flat rather than up to F. It's just so cool right in here. I really, really love this. So as you can see, it really is all, I don't want to say much of a muchness, because that context for that is that it's somehow kind of tepid, right? It's more of a B flat thing. Well, this is a D flat thing. But it's all very much like a build towards the apex, the final crashing finale, the finale of the finale. And cumulatively using the same elements and building and getting bigger and bigger. And the trumpets take over. Bum, 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 was going even higher than where the horns were before. Let's keep on with the themes. Bum, bum, bum. Cornets this time, and trombones in octaves, and tuba on the bottom. Bum, bum, bum. I think it's interesting that the trumpets are really not involved with the melody towards the end. They just end up playing this big chord. Yeah, just really lovely brass scoring in here. Doubled octaves in the horns, sounding F. And then don't forget that we are in tenor clef here, right? So these are D octaves with a B in the middle. And then this low G here in the tuba, which is doubled by the contrabassoon. We've also got the cello and the double bass down in here. Position ordinaire, ending the series of all down bows that was on the previous screen. Notice how the top Debussy cello is doubling the third trombone, and the bottom Debussy cello is doubling all of the bassoons. And very simple, effective scoring right in there. Right here, we're going into kind of more of a 6/4 sort of a feel, with these quarter note triplets just really taking over. Timpani and pizzicato basses and cellos, this time doubling at pitch. right? An octave lower than the timpani. And really, really effective. It's almost like having timpani octaves right in here, the way that it's scored. Horns playing unga, 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 unga. So they're maintaining some of the feeling of 4/4 time here, while other elements conspire, like these horns right in here, second and third horn, playing these staccato triplets right in here. Coolest thing for me is this kind of foghorn down here. Bum, bum. And an octave lower, we have this rock bottom contrabassoon. Notice here sort of the ridiculousness of scoring contrabassoon at pitch. You get to this point and you have to mark an ottava bassa. Here it's marked over it. It really should be marked under for clarity of meaning. And then, of course, like third bassoon is doubling that foghorn right in here of the tuba. So, what is everybody else doing in all of this? Well, before I get to that, just notice that we have a very long note here. Half note on our bass drum, and a big old boosh on the tam-tam. I kind of like the brighter sound of the tam-tam that's being used in this recording by Kaleidoscope. I just feel that that is more in character for this piece. So, the swirling against the dotted rhythm of the winds is carrying on. Notice that the flutes are becoming more thematic, almost, like they're looping around rather than just going back and forth between two pitches. Now here, we get into a game of opposites between the winds and the strings, with the only wind that conspires with or supports the strings is the piccolo, doubling the first violins. And then right here we just have octaves. It's violas plus second violins on the lower octave and first violins on the upper octave, with the rest of the winds kind of doing a reversal. Dun 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 da dun 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 da da in the strings, and then in the winds, da 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 da, just kind of going the opposite direction. That creates just a wonderful sense of swirling in the background for the rest of the brass. It really is basic what's going on here. It's just very loud. There's not a whole lot of complexity to it, but we've got our kind of 6/4 ones and fives in the timpani and the lower strings pizzicato. And then the horns playing the 4/4 unga tenuto staccato. And by the way, it's really not necessary to put a slur over tenuto staccato. It's implied that the notes will all kind of connect. And then, of course, the melodic content. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-da, and it just all leads to this terrific tutti chord at the end. Now, here you will be able to hear flutes, piccolo, oboes trilling, English horn, probably not as much, clarinets trilling. So the clarinets and the oboes and flutes are all doubling. And you'll be able to hear that. You'll be able to hear the piccolo on top on that high D flat. You'll be able to hear the strings doing the tremolo. You might not hear the violas and cellos quite as powerfully, but they will be present. And right here is the simplest kind of scoring, really. It's just a simple D-flat major triad. Remember, we're still in tenor clef. We have a D-flat triad here in the trombones. We have a D-flat triad here in the trumpets. And here we've got a D-flat fifth, which is doubling the outside of this chord here in the trombones. So the lower notes, these A-flats, written A-flat sounding D-flats, are just reinforcing the root note here. It really does look like a G major chord, doesn't it? If you're thinking of bass clef. But yeah, just remember you're in tenor clef. And so that is a D-flat right there. So yeah, so those bottom notes are reinforcing that lower note, and right here in the middle, between the trumpets and the lower trombones, this note right here, this A flat here, is being trilled by the horns. And I just think that's a wonderful sound. Trilling horns is something you don't want to do too often. It has wonderful energy and life and vibrance, but I gotta say, if you put brass trills in everything all the time, people get sick of it really quickly. So here it's used at the absolute best time. You know, it isn't really used before, but here, you know, you've got this half-step trill. It's marked right in here, written E flat to written E natural. All right, so A flat to A natural. And here that's written as A flat to B double flat. I just did one of these Christmas arrangements and I had to put in some B double flats. I hope they don't hate me for it, but it doesn't make any sense harmonically to write in A natural. Just right at the end, sec, so in other words, not allowing the stroke to resonate. It's immediately cut off by the hand here on this rest. We have a ba-bum from the timpani right on that D flat and the entire string section as well. And it has a really nice quality right in there. We've got these two notes here, the same exact note, playing an octave below the timpani. There's no need for anything to play at the same pitch as the timpani. And then violas and firsts and seconds all playing the same D flat together. So it's really just a triple octave here of marcato, staccato strings and marcato timpani. And it's just a wonderful kind of closing of the door. I am going to leave you with that. And once again, thank you all for watching. Thank my Patreon supporters for making this possible. And it's just really been wonderful talking about all of this with you. And it took a little bit longer than I thought. There were some lectures at the end that got interfered with by other plans. They still kept coming, but it didn't quite have this rapidity that I had planned initially. All the same, we made it through it, and I just really feel explaining it all to you forced me to really describe everything that is happening in a way that I would more subconsciously absorb rather than actively rationalize. So in the process of lecturing on this work to you, it made a lot of things much more clear to me and forced me to really think about what I was looking at in a deeper way. And I think that's true whenever you try to explain any great masterpiece by a great mind of the past. The more you get into it, the more you learn about it, even if you are the teacher. I mean, if I knew everything about everything all the time, what a boring world this would be. I'm really glad that every time I look at a great work, it says something different to me, if I allow it to. And that is, I feel, the biggest quality of genius in a work of genius. That every time you listen to it, something about the artist's language tells you something more every time, or something different every time, and something about your own experience, either as an artist who is developing themselves or as somebody who just appreciates art, is also changed and enriched. And I think that if that quality is lacking, then the piece needs more work. So with that, listen for all of those things. The very simple structure here of the brass, just basically two D-flat major triads stacked on top of each other with the horn trills, and then, of course, with all of the upper winds trilling together, except for the piccolo on that high D-flat, accompanying the tremolos. Listen for the sort of flux here between these upper string octaves and the winds playing kind of the reverse direction. Listen for this big foghorn, which I really love, the third bassoon, contrabassoon on that rock bottom D-flat, and the tuba, of course, which is going to actually be the biggest sound. And the way that this melody sort of wraps everything up. The rhythmic counterpoint between the horns playing 4 and the pizzicato and timpani playing 6. The way this swirling in the strings pushes towards the final 7 bars of this work. Just that There's a wonderful crescendo right in here with the Ah3 trumpets echoing what happened before with Ah4 horns, and really a good answer to go from Ah4 horns to Ah3 trumpets. And then, of course, this page in itself is a really great illustration of the use of articulation and cumulative texture, basically just building and developing and getting bigger, and just the way the elements come into play and are just so wonderfully scored. Listen for the way that the swirling in the winds starts to stack in octaves and then leap upward another octave in the upper strings. Listen for the reintroduction of the first theme of the piece right here at the end, very sonorously. Listen for more of that rhythmic counterpoint right in here, the syncopation between the fours and the horns and the sixes in the lower instruments. Listen for that quality of all down bows going all the way through here, even on the marcato, contrasted with the sol ponticello playing of the upper strings. And then, of course, the wonderful quality of the cornet, right? Just has that lighter sound. Some people denigrate it and say, oh, well, the cornets are kind of like a cheesy trumpet, but I don't feel that way at all. I feel that it is a light kind of a sound, and it has its place, really. I mean, I wish that I could put cornet into some of my bigger works from time to time, but there just isn't the budget these days. And then, of course, this wonderful big, huge tutti chord, with a caution that if you don't support the upper winds with string doubling, then the sound just becomes all about the overtones of the brass. Listen to those just little touches of percussion right in there, and this wonderful question and answer between the Ah4 horns and just the first cornet, right, is enough. And then this big push here from trumpets and horns back into the big tutti chord. But, of course, my favorite part of all is just the interaction between the winds and the strings and how they help to lead back up to this moment as well. Listen for all of those things, and once again, my thanks to all for your participation in this. If you are just a viewer, I would love to know what you thought about this series, and if you are a supporter, even more thanks to you. Without the support of my Patreon crowd, there would not be any of these lecture series on the internet. So maybe some other composer or orchestrator would have to do that. But especially with the way that my time has been so distracted lately with two major projects, it really brings home to me the appreciation that I feel towards everybody for keeping me involved with this educational activity and working with the community and helping to develop orchestrators towards their potential. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you again soon with a new orchestration study series.